Walking out of the hospital, the last person I expected to run into was my ex-wife. It had only been 2 months since the divorce papers were signed, and seeing her face brought back a lot of anger. I tried to keep my head down and walk past her without making a scene. I was almost to the exit when a doctor stepped in my path and grabbed my arm. He asked if I was Mark. When I nodded, he lowered his voice and told me the chilling truth about why she was begging to see me. Mark adjusted the heavy strap of his leather bag as he navigated the long corridor. The smell of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, reminding him of why he hated hospitals. He had just finished visiting his uncle and wanted nothing more than to get home. The day had been long and his patience was wearing thin. He checked his watch and realized rush hour traffic would start soon. He picked up his pace to reach the exit faster. The automatic doors were just ahead, offering an escape from the sterile environment. Just as he reached for his car keys, a figure near the entrance caught his eye. A woman stood by the glass, looking confused and slightly out of place. Her silhouette looked incredibly familiar, causing Mark to pause mid-step. He squinted against the afternoon glare coming through the windows. It took a moment for his brain to register who he was actually looking at. It was Sarah. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking her posture or the way she held her arms. Mark felt a knot tighten in his stomach at the sight of her. The divorce had been messy, and he was not ready for a confrontation today. He quickly averted his gaze, hoping she hadn't noticed him yet. He shifted his bag to his other shoulder and angled his body away from her direction. Mark kept his eyes focused on the floor tiles and walked faster. He calculated the distance to the door and figured he could slip past if he hurried. The last thing he needed was an awkward conversation or another argument in a public place. He just wanted to get to his car and drive away. He tightened his grip on the strap of his bag and moved with determination. Every step took him closer to freedom. Just as he thought he was in the clear, a figure stepped directly into his path. Mark nearly collided with a tall man wearing a white coat and a stethoscope. The interruption forced him to come to an abrupt halt right in the middle of the hallway. He looked up, annoyed at the delay. The medical professional stood his ground and did not move out of the way. It seemed intentional rather than accidental. The man reached out and placed a heavy hand on Mark's shoulder to keep him from moving. He looked directly at Mark with a serious expression on his face. He asked if Mark was indeed Mark Reynolds. The question caught Mark off guard, as he didn't know this doctor. He wondered how a stranger in this massive hospital knew his name. The situation suddenly felt much more complicated than a chance encounter. Mark ceased his attempts to leave and gave a slow nod of confirmation. He felt a sense of unease creeping up his spine. His eyes darted past the doctor toward the waiting area where he had seen Sarah. He wondered if she had sent this man to stop him. It seemed like the only logical explanation for this interference. He waited for the doctor to explain what this was all about. The doctor did not speak immediately but motioned for Mark to come with him. He led the way toward a secluded alcove just off the main hallway. The area was quiet and removed from the prying eyes of other visitors and staff. Mark followed reluctantly, his curiosity now outweighing his desire to leave. He needed to know why he was being detained. The doctor's demeanor suggested the matter was urgent. From his new vantage point, Mark had a clear view of the nurse's station down the hall. He saw Sarah again, but she wasn't leaving like he originally thought. She was walking in small circles, looking lost and disoriented amidst the bustling staff. She didn't seem to have a purpose or a destination in mind. It was strange behavior for someone who was usually so organized and direct. Mark frowned as he watched her, The physician turned his back to the hallway and opened a thick beige folder he was carrying. He pulled out a chart filled with graphs and medical terminology. Mark glanced at the papers, though he couldn't make sense of the data. The doctor tapped the top page with his pen to draw Mark's attention. He seemed to be preparing to deliver some significant news. Mark braced himself for whatever the man was about to say. The man lowered his voice so that only Mark could hear him. He pointed a finger down the corridor toward where Sarah was still standing. He asked Mark if that was, indeed, his wife. Mark corrected him, stating she was his ex-wife, but the doctor waved the distinction away. The physician's focus remained entirely on Sarah and her presence in the hospital. The serious tone made Mark's stomach turn. Mark leaned back against the cool wall of the alcove to steady himself. He watched as a nurse approached Sarah and gently took her by the arm. The nurse spoke softly to her and guided her away from the public waiting area. Sarah went willingly, which was unlike her usual independent nature. It looked like she was being escorted deeper into the facility. This observation confused Mark even more. The doctor flipped to a specific page in the file and held it up for Mark to see. It was an image of a brain scan with dark, shaded areas. The doctor traced a finger around the frontal lobe section of the image. He mentioned that the damage shown here was extensive and concerning. Mark stared at the black and white film, trying to process the visual information. The gravity of the situation began to sink in. Mark asked why they were showing him this if Sarah was just visiting someone. The doctor shook his head and corrected the assumption immediately. He explained that Sarah was not a visitor at all. She had been a patient in the neurological wing for the past 3 weeks. Mark felt the blood drain from his face at the news. He had no idea she had been hospitalized for nearly a month. The doctor continued to speak about the severity of her condition. He described a rapidly progressing neurological issue that impacted her cognitive abilities. It affected how her brain processed daily functions and routine tasks. Mark listened without interrupting, hanging on every word. The anger he felt earlier was quickly replaced by shock and concern. It explained why she looked so lost near the nurse's station earlier. After closing the file, the doctor gestured for Mark to follow him again. They walked past the nurse's station and down a long, quiet hallway. The sounds of the busy hospital faded as they reached the patient rooms. The doctor finally stopped in front of a door marked with the number 300. He turned to Mark, indicating that this was where Sarah was staying. Mark stared at the number on the door. Mark stood outside the room, his hand hovering over the metal handle. He took a deep breath to compose himself before facing her. He wasn't sure what to expect or what condition she would be in. With a heavy sigh, he pushed the wooden door open and stepped inside. The room was dim, lit only by the afternoon sun filtering through the blinds. He looked around for Sarah. Sarah was sitting on the edge of the bed wearing a standard hospital gown. She looked fragile compared to the woman he remembered arguing with 2 months ago. When she heard the door click shut, she lifted her head. Her eyes locked onto his and her expression changed instantly. There was no anger or resentment in her gaze. She simply looked relieved to see him standing there. A bright smile spread across her face, one that Mark hadn't seen in years. She looked genuinely happy and excited by his arrival. She shifted her weight and patted the empty spot on the mattress beside her. It was an invitation for him to sit close. Mark remained frozen by the door, confused by her warm welcome. It was a stark contrast to their last encounter in court. Mark took a few tentative steps into the room, closing the distance between them. He didn't sit down but stood awkwardly by the bedside rail. The air in the room felt thick with unspoken tension on his part. He kept his hands in his pockets, unsure of how to interact with her. Sarah just kept smiling up at him, waiting for him to say something. He looked back at the door for support. The doctor stepped into the room behind Mark and leaned in close to his ear. He whispered the final piece of the puzzle that explained her behavior. The neurological damage had caused severe and specific memory loss. She had absolutely no recollection of the last few months, including the divorce. As far as she knew, they were still a couple. Mark looked at Sarah with wide eyes, finally understanding. Sarah reached out and took Mark's hand in hers before he could pull away. Her grip was warm and familiar, sending a jolt through him. She asked him why he was so late coming home from work today. Her tone was casual, like any normal evening from their past. She didn't seem to realize she was in a hospital room. Mark struggled to find his voice to answer her. She didn't wait for an answer before continuing her chatter. She started talking about their anniversary dinner next week and the restaurant she wanted to try. She squeezed his fingers affectionately, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Mark felt a lump form in his throat as she planned a future that didn't exist. She believed they were still happily married. The reality of the situation was heartbreaking. Mark glanced back at the doctor, who gave a solemn nod. There was no point in causing her distress by explaining the truth right now. Mark turned back to Sarah and made a choice. He slowly sat down on the edge of the bed next to her. He decided to play along for the moment to keep her calm. Correcting her would only cause unnecessary pain. He adjusted his grip and held her hand gently in his. He forced a small smile onto his face to match hers. He asked her what she was thinking of ordering for dinner that night. Sarah beamed at him, content and unaware of the tragedy surrounding them. For now, in her mind, everything was perfect. Mark sat there, holding the hand of the woman he had lost twice.